Alright, I wanted to do some lectures as I can, not necessarily to completely fulfill what you should be doing as far as reading goes, but maybe to go alongside it, because I realize that these chapters are pretty dense as far as reading goes, and it can just be a lot of material to cover in a short amount of time. For instance, this particular lesson will do chapter 17, and this is covering 250 years of history, and so that's a whole lot of material that's covering the entire world. It's a lot to do, and so as we focus even just on Europe, it's a lot of material in a short amount of time. So I thought I'd try and do just a little bit of material. If you want to follow along in your book, I'll kind of hit a couple of high spots. I'll go ahead and point out to you now. If you look in your book, you'll find bolded or highlighted terms. Those are going to be the ones that you're most likely to see on your quizzes. So maybe that'll help you as you start to prepare for those quizzes. I will remind you that there is no replacement for reading, but as I said, I know that some of it can be pretty dense. And as you start out this chapter, we do start out with probably one of my favorite subjects, and that is France. France is so fascinating to me as far as their long legacy of monarchy rule, having a king and queen in so many ways. Them and England really do define what we as Americans understand the king and queen and royalty and regalness. They are who we look to as far as that goes. And so when we start in France, I'll point out that I'm looking down at my notes. As we start out in France, it's good to point out that there's a lot going on. We are in a world right now, historically speaking, that is struggling. They are in a crisis. They are trying to rebuild. But in so many ways, this chapter, particularly as we talk about France, you can see the breeding ground of what will later become the French Revolution. You can better understand how we are really in so many ways propelling ourselves through history towards that event. The crisis that we're seeing in Europe, particularly in France, right there at the beginning of the chapter, is twofold. Number one, wages. The people are not being paid enough, and number two is the food is scarce. What food is there is too expensive. We're not making enough money, so I can't pay for the food, and the food prices are going up because there's not enough food. It is a supply and demand issue, and the countryside is going through a drought. The people are struggling. Now, the percentage of people in Europe, or excuse me, France particularly at this point, they are somewhere between 90-95% Catholic at this point. Historically speaking, this is about the time that we see that change. We've already had the Protestant Reformation in the last portion of this particular class. The French countryside is changing just a little bit. You have the rise of the French Protestant, aka Huguenot. Maybe you've heard that terminology before. But really more importantly in referring to this portion of history is the makeup of the social classes. We are seeing by far the majority of the people are peasants, or they're common people, I should say, because even what we would deem as middle class come into that particular section of society, and they are really nobodies. The way French society was broken out was commoners, nobility, and clergy. These two groups, the nobility and the clergy, are tiny in comparison to this. I should have looked up the exact statistics, but we're talking about maybe 90% of the people are commoners, and yet there are three voices in their outside council, and they all have an equal vote. That doesn't seem very fair, right? I mean, the majority of the people fall in this category, and they get one vote total, such as are the same as nobility and the clergy. But it is what it is. During this time period, we also see the Black Death sweep through Europe, and this is a problem for all the people, but it's more specifically a peasant problem. The peasants are blamed for it as they're unclean, they don't take care of themselves, etc. And then, of course, the nobility, the few that are stricken with it, are angry and frustrated at the peasants. Of course, how do they deal with that? How are they supposed to combat that when they don't have modern day medicine and they don't have the help? For those of you that don't know what the bubonic plague is, I'm sure you've at least heard of it. Swollen, painful knobs basically forming on the skin. It's transmitted by the bite of a flea, and it can basically turn into gangrene of the fingers, toes, lips, mouth, and you also see, essentially, it's just an infection that grows between 2 and 5 days after exposure, and we see this general feeling of illness. We're talking about flu type symptoms, what we would understand the flu to be, on top of the gangrene, as well as muscle cramps, seizures. It's just a debilitating, disgusting disease, and it's very, very painful. It kind of ends with heavy breathing, vomiting of blood, aching limbs, extreme pain, the decay and decomposition of the body as far as the skin goes, gastrointestinal issues, etc., etc. It's just awful, awful, awful. The mortality rate is about 40 to 60%, so it's pretty bad. And you throw in that as an issue with not enough food and not enough money to go around. This is a problem. During this time period, we also are encountering what's called the 30 Years' War. Essentially, we are seeing the Lutherans forming something called the Protestant Union, who are fighting against the Catholic League. And it's kind of one of those things that they're fighting against each other. They say it's a religious issue, but in this day and age, as far as politics and religion go, they're synonymous. They really are about the same thing. It ends with the Peace of Westphalia, which is a term you'd want to know for your test. It's an agreement that became permanent, and it recognized Calvinism. And it's a temporary peace, as many of these historical battles are in Europe. We see that they have a temporary peace. It seems that they're almost constantly at war. The war ended up killing about 1/3 of the city dwellers, 2/5 of the country dwellers, and it destroyed many cities, trade, decimated farms, etc. It's just really debilitating. Your book talks a little bit about what the infrastructure of the states or nations in Europe look like, and kind of the crowning moment or the crowning purpose or driving force of European politics is something called absolute power, and that's given to them, the king and queen, the people believe, by God. And I'm sorry, at this day and age, who's going to fight God? If God's put this man or woman in charge of our country, who am I to say that they're wrong? Who am I to say they are overtaxing me? These are issues that are about to become larger and questioned. We'll even see that start a little bit in the next chapter. There is a number of different factors that go into that. This isn't just in France, it's also in Spain, and it is actually all across Europe, which is going to cause a number of different problems. As you continue to read about France and Spain specifically, you'll notice a little bit about their economy and how that works. The driving force is mercantilism. Yes, it's an agrarian society, but trade is how that agrarian society, those two things go together. You're growing particular crops, you're making particular goods from those crops, and then you're selling them, trading with other countries more often than not. With that, we see the rise of territorialism and the need for outside territories that's going to drive up my ability to produce more so I can sell more, and I'm exclusively going to force you as one of my colonies to purchase only from me. It's very exploitive, very detrimental to those societies that have been conquered or colonized. Going beyond that, We see that these monarchies are spending more than they're making, which is going to mean that they're going to crack down harder on the commoners. They're going to make them pay more in taxes, and the nobility and the clergy are going to, more often than not, somehow skirt that issue, not having to pay those taxes, or certainly not as much. And on top of that, it's going to amp up that desire to colonize more, because if I can get another colony, then they can help pay into my treasury as the king or queen. And of course, this isn't just in Spain and France. This is happening all across Europe. And if you can imagine a map of Europe, it eventually sweeps across Europe, even over into Russia. It sweeps across Austria and Prussia as well. We see a problem of the particular countries dealing with this form of monarchy really imposing on the people. And what do people do? And they're starting to, I kind of imagine they've been in a dreamlike state of, well, this is just the way it is, and they're starting to wake up at this point. The people are, they've not quite got to the point of revolution. Oh, we've still got a couple of chapters to go. But they are starting to go, how do we pay for this? Why am I paying for this? I don't want a new crown. I don't need this or that. And so the people are starting to be frustrated. So make sure to read about all of those different countries and their struggle for that. We even see something called westernization. In the section about Russia, you'll see a lot about this westernization as it swept across Europe. With that, Russia is adopting some of these ideas that have come with it. It's not just political, it's not just religious, it's social too. They're starting to see, you know what, the way we do things isn't quite up to snuff. We're not quite the way the rest of the world is acting, particularly Western Europe. And part of those ways that they are westernizing themselves include shaving their beards, they're wearing Western clothing, that's not country or cowboy clothing, by the way. They are choosing their own spouse, and these are pretty big deals. Now, this is unpopular with some, obviously, but it is a huge, huge change. In that, your book moves into searching for alternatives to this absolutism, this idea that the king and queen hold all of the absolute power. My apologies for air quotes. They're so annoying, but hopefully that helps a little bit. In that, you see some terms, constitutionalism, republicanism. These are new ideas that are coming to the forefront to answer the question of the people and kind of meet their needs a little bit more. So make sure and look into those. Also, when you look specifically at England, you see post-Protestant Reformation, a country that is completely broken away from the Catholic Church, and they are leaning on a different type of understanding. And with that, as they've broken away, they've become Protestant. They go through their ups and downs. Post-Henry VIII, you've got Henry's son who comes in and takes the throne. He amps up this effort towards the Church of England a little bit more. He dies very quickly. Edward was always ill. He was not a very well child. His sister comes back from Catholic Spain background, and she comes in, brings back the Catholic Church for 5 years, dies suddenly, and her sister Elizabeth comes to the throne, and she restores Protestant England. In this process, the back and forth, the Protestant movement is solidifying its hold in England. What's important about that is we're going to see the growth of the Puritans. And the reason that's important is because the Puritans are called that because they do not feel like the Church of England has purified itself enough of the Catholic Church. They bought into the Reformation 100%, but what they saw the Church of England doing was basically they are the Catholic Church, they have the same vestments, they have the same priests doing the same things, saying the same things, they just don't have the Pope in Rome. Instead, they've essentially got a Pope, so to speak, that's sitting on the throne there in London. And so these are things that we see changing in England particularly, and then of course it's going to move across Europe as well. That's going to have an impact not just religiously but also socially and politically. The Puritans are frustrating to most regular Englishmen, and they become persecuted, which will eventually lead to that great migration over to what we call the New World. This new colonization that I keep mentioning, there is this push to move over into the Americas. France, England, even the Dutch are moving over that way, Spain as well. They're moving over, they're growing crops, they're finding raw materials, they're finding people to work those fields and those mines all in the Americas, and this is going to help fund those coffers of the king and queen. With that, we see a number of different issues that come into play. Again, we're not just talking about politically, but we are also talking religiously and socially. And so make sure as you read this chapter, kind of pick up on those things. Again, this was just meant to be a quick overview so that you'd have something to complement your reading. And I'll be back shortly with Chapter 18.